Again, all we're going to be asking ourselves is what is the relative quantities demanded at every relative price. So you may recall that our relative demand curves actually look the same, so it's not like we have two. So our world relative demand curve will be downward sloping to the right, pretty much like most demand curves, relative or otherwise. Okay. So here's our world relative supply curve, and here's our world relative demand curve. Okay. So there are several things to note. That once we open it up to international trade, our world equilibrium is at point A. Several things have happened here. One is the relative price of cloth has risen in Portugal, and the relative price of cloth has fallen in England. So when you think about what's happening, when we open it up to international trade, Portuguese cloth producers say, wow, I can sell my stuff a lot for a lot higher price in England, so I'm going to export some cloth to England. By exporting cloth to England, there's less available now in Portugal, which helps to drive up the price of cloth. There's more cloth now available in England, which helps bring the price of cloth down in England. English wine producers are looking at exactly the same situation. They're saying, wow, if I sell some of my wine in Portugal, I can get a higher price there than I can get here. So England starts exporting wine to Portugal. Less supply available in England drives the price of wine down, or the relative price of cloth. Drives the price of wine up, which drives the relative price of cloth down. And then in Portugal, you've got more wine coming in, so the price of wine will fall, the relative price of cloth will rise. So both the import and the export side of the equation will cause these prices to begin, relative prices, to converge between the two countries. So one of the big factors about international trade, we see it in this very simple model, we'll see it time and time again. The greater we have international trade, the greater the convergence of relative prices of the goods that are being traded. Okay? So the more international trade there is, the more convergence of international prices or relative prices of those goods that are actually being traded. Okay? Just for calculation issues, let's call this 1. It doesn't need to be 1. What we do know is that it needs to be between 1/2 and 2. But let's just, for the time being, call it 1 because it'll make the arithmetic better. Oh, one other thing to notice about this. Okay, I said there were two things. So we get the convergence of prices here. The other thing that happens in this particular situation is each country fully specializes in the production of only one good. So notice, Portugal only produces cloth and no wine. England only produces wine and no cloth. I'll come back to that point in just a second, but let's continue with that for just a minute. Okay, now we want to think about, okay, this sounds really good. What are the gains from trade? What does Portugal actually get out of this? So how do we show what's going on? Remember, this is our autarky condition. So how do we show what's going on once we open it up to international trade? Any ideas? I'm sorry? Okay, the relative price changes for cloth. So how would we show that on this diagram? Okay, the slope of the production possibilities frontier will change, right? So the first thing to keep in mind is that the original slope here, this slope was what? Minus 1/2. That was our relative opportunity cost. That was also our relative prices. But relative prices have now increased. Right? So what that means then is the slope of this production possibilities frontier is no longer going to be 1/2. It's going to be 1. Minus 1/2 minus 1. And that suggests that this production possibilities curve will be steeper or flatter? Steeper. So I'm absolutely sure I can't show this right, but it would be... So this now becomes our new... Whoops. Be careful here. Labeling is careful. This is our new... what do we do? This is our new budget constraint. Now remember, in autarky, the budget constraint and the production possibilities frontier are exactly the same. One lies right on top of the other, so we can't distinguish them. But now we can. So why do we know, by the way, that this isn't our production possibilities frontier, as I almost mistakenly mislabeled it? Why do we know that? Okay, it's not just Portugal, but this is just Portugal that we're looking at.
We're looking at not how much can produce, but we're looking at
Well, yes, that's true, but how do we know that this cannot be a production possibilities frontier? Exactly. Portugal can't produce that much. It still has the same labor force, and it has the same unit labor requirements. So it couldn't possibly be producing any more than its production possibilities frontier. Okay, so what's happening here? We've already said that production in cloth is going to increase, and Portugal will become fully specialized in cloth production. So we're moving out to the maximum amount of cloth production that we can have. We're also going to zero wine production. Now, what happens to demand? What happens to our consumption pattern here? Remember, the residents of Portugal want to consume both cloth and wine, so they need to buy wine from England. Now notice, in a closed economy, if they were producing cloth and they wanted to exchange it for wine, they needed to move along the production possibilities frontier or the autarky budget line. Now, however, this is what we're producing, but now we're exchanging it with England. And the exchange ratio with England's 1 for 1. It's not 2 for 1. And so now we're going up along this much steeper budget line. So what we would find then if we had a whole family of country indifference curves, we would now find a tangency way up here. By the way, I've exaggerated all of these figures just so that we can see them easily. And what we would end up with is a little bit of a reduction in the consumption of cloth and a big increase in the consumption of wine. Right? Wine prices are a lot lower, so we're going to buy a lot more. Now, of course, if you're consuming more than you're producing, these have to be your imports of wine. And of course, you need to be exporting something to pay for that, so these are your exports of cloth, the difference between your domestic production and your domestic consumption. Yes? That's right. So if the relative price changed to something more, then this line's still going to be steeper, right? Because we've shown that the relative price of cloth in Portugal is going to rise, so it's going to be steeper. All we need to do is find where it's tangent to the country indifference curve. That'll change the quantity demanded of both wine and cloth, not the supply side, because we're fully specialized, and therefore we would have different quantities of imports in exports. Yes?
Does that mean Portugal's importing all its wine?
In this particular case, it's importing all of its wine. The two countries are completely specialized. Okay, now, one of the things that we can show is that we've moved to a higher, I mean, it's very obvious here because I drew it very big. One of the things that we can see is that the country has moved to a higher country indifference curve. Right? We've moved from CIC naught to CIC 1. That means we have a higher level of economic welfare. Aggregate economic welfare has improved. Okay? Trade has benefited Portugal in the aggregate. We'll see a little bit later that trade has actually increased welfare for everybody in Portugal. Okay? So that's our yes. So indifference curves are measures of economic welfare. Okay? So the higher the indifference curve, the higher the level of economic welfare. Okay, we can do the same thing for England. Now in England, the situation's a little bit different. Remember here, they're going to specialize completely in wine. So wine production increases. Cloth production goes to 0. Now remember, for England, the relative price of cloth fell to 1. Remember before, pre-trade, the pre-trade relative price was 2. So what does that mean about the slope of the budget line? Steeper or flatter? Flatter. So we now come out to something that looks like that, if that actually has a slope of -1. And our original PPF has a slope equal to -2. So again, notice what happens. England is going to completely specialize in the production of wine. Now they can buy cloth more cheaply from Portugal than they can buy it from domestic English producers. So they get to actually move down along this budget line to find where it is that they would like to be consuming. So England will also move to a higher country indifference curve at a point such as B, the tangency, resulting in an increased demand for cloth. Right? Not terribly surprising, since cloth was very expensive in England to begin with, and has now become cheaper, and a small reduction in the demand for wine. So England is now producing more wine than it's consuming. So these are the difference being England's exports. They're now consuming more cloth than they're producing, production being at 0. So this becomes their imports. Okay. Remember the way we set this up with the numbers that we used. Portugal had an absolute advantage in the production of both cloth and wine. Meaning, of course, that England was the least efficient producer in both industries. And yet, we can see here, by engaging in international trade, in specializing along the lines of comparative advantage, England, which has an absolute disadvantage in all industries, can actually increase its level of aggregate economic welfare. Also notice, by the way, I think that was point number 3 from our 6 valuable lessons, also notice that the wine industry in Portugal was more efficient than the wine industry in England. They had an absolute advantage. Yet, even though they were the most efficient producer in the world, that industry lost from international trade. They had an absolute advantage. They did not have a comparative advantage. When it comes to international trade and the gains from international trade, comparative advantage is what matters, not absolute advantage. Adam Smith was wrong. David Ricardo was right. Okay, before we go on, I just want to go back here and make sure that this is not the only possible solution, the kind of relative demand curve that we have here. It is possible that the relative demand curve could be here, right? In which case, notice that the relative prices will change for England, but not for Portugal. England will still be completely specialized in wine production, but Portugal will produce cloth and wine relative to demand conditions. It's also possible for the relative demand curve to be way up here, in which case relative prices have changed for Portugal, but not for England. Portugal will be completely specialized in production of cloth. England will still be producing some cloth and some wine. Most of the situations that are analyzed, however, using this model, you end up somewhere in between, but that is not a necessary condition. Okay, so we see here then that within the context of the Ricardian model, relative prices converge once we open up the international trade. By the way, we'll see that again and again and again and again and again and again. It has nothing special to do with the Ricardian model. All models of international trade give you a convergence of relative prices of traded goods. So now we want to think about what happens to relative wages rather than relative prices. So let's start by thinking about our pre-trade situation. And here we've got Portugal, and here we have England. So in Portugal, our autarky price, relative price of cloth was 1/2. We had a price of cloth we assumed was $10, and the price of wine was $20. Okay. Now remember what we said. It doesn't matter the absolute numbers that we're picking here. It's only the ratio that actually matters. So with our normal, with our standard unit labor requirements that we've been using, we saw that in equilibrium, wages had to be the same in both industries, and it came out at $10. And over in England, our relative prices were 2. The price of cloth was $20, and the price of wine was $10. So again, wages in the cloth industry were equal to wages in the wine industry, and that came out to $3.33. Okay? So that was our pre-trade situation. So remember 10 and 333. So now we're specializing, right? So all Portuguese workers are only producing cloth. They are going to earn, right? This is where our wage is. This is how we determine it. So we said that the relative price of cloth went to 1. So let's just assume that the price of cloth equals $15 and the price of wine equals 15. So this now means that we've got $15 divided by our unit labor requirement of 1. So workers in the Portuguese wine industry, all Portuguese workers, are now making $15 an hour. So notice that Portuguese workers are making more money with international trade than they were in autarky. In England, the price of wine has fallen to $15. Our unit labor requirement is 3, and therefore wages have gone up to $5. So notice again, workers in England are better off. So nominal wages have risen in both countries. Nominal wages have risen in both countries. And finally, notice that the ratio of wages between the two countries is 15/5, or 3. Okay? That's our relative wages. Okay. Oh, I didn't realize I had that. Oh, okay. What's interesting about those relative wages at 3 is that those relative wages lie between the relative productivities in the industries. Right? So what we saw is Portugal was 6 times more productive than Portuguese cloth workers were 6 times more productive than English cloth workers, but Portuguese cloth workers were only 2/3 more productive than English. Cloth, blah blah blah. Wine producers. So we've got this relative wage lying between the relative productivities in the two industries. Okay. So what does that mean? Yes. I made it up. Okay, so it doesn't matter what you want to make the price as long as the ratio is 1, which is what we assume. Actually, the ratio doesn't have to be 1. It just needs to be more than 1/2 and less than 2. So it'd be an interesting exercise if you picked 1 1/2 and worked through what wages would be, what relative wages will be, and just to make sure that calculations that I'm doing are actually accurate. Occasionally I mess up, probably more than occasionally.